Good afternoon. My name is Jerne Littner Černić, and I'll be chairing today's academic forum of the new University on Business and Human Rights in Central and Eastern Europe. And with me today, there are several distinguished experts in the field of business and human rights in Central and Eastern Europe. Let me first introduce them. First, we have Ms. Anna Dangova-Huk, who works at Interpartners law firm in Skopje, North Macedonia. Then we have Nevina Dičić-Kostić, who is a consultant for Belgrade Center for Human Rights and also expert on business and human rights. Then we have Professor Olena Uvarova, who is a head of International Lab on Business and Human Rights at Yaroslav Mudry National Law University in Kharkiv, Ukraine. And we also have with us Siniša Milatović from Undp. Siniša is also expert on business and human rights in Central and Eastern Europe. And lastly, we have our own professor, Goras Justinek, who is a business professor. Today's topic of today's forum is business and human rights in Central and Eastern Europe. Why we want to focus today on Central Eastern Europe? Central Eastern Europe is one of the five regional groups of United Nations, and it merits a special debate on business and human rights, debate which is perhaps a bit distinguished from Western and Northern and Southern Europe because of several facts. One of the facts is that most of the countries in this region, of all of the countries in this region, shared a common history. They were all part of socialist, or if you want, communist systems. They share also some common features of functioning of economy. Most of their economies were centrally planned from 1940s until 1990s, and most of the countries they also have seen a real increase of foreign investment, liberalization and privatization after the fall of Iron Curtain in 1989. So those distinguished facts perhaps differ the region from other regions in Europe. And we will dedicate today's discussions on the recent development in Central Eastern Europe concerning business and human rights. We will talk about developments concerning national action plans on business human rights. We'll look into some good practices, best practices from selected countries, but then we also finally we want to address deficiencies in business human rights in the region, but also look forward, how the region can perhaps strengthen business and human rights standards to benefit of the human dignity or rights holders. So there is a much to be discussed. Perhaps some facts at the beginning, if you allow me. There are about 24 countries which are part of Central Eastern Europe. So far, 4 countries have adopted national action plans on business and human rights. Czech Republic, Poland, Slovenia, Lithuania. Georgia has some years ago adopted a chapter on business and human rights as a part of their national action plan on human rights. At the moment, there are some countries which are developing national action plan, such as we'll hear from Olena in a Ukraine case. And then second part of the facts which I want to mention, which are the largest corporations which operate or which derive from the region. Those are mostly based in Russian Federation. Those are the companies such as Gazprom, Rusnet, Lukoil, Surkovneft, Sberbank, and Transnet. Most of the companies which are in many ways, connected with the government of Russian Federation. And this is one of the particular features of business and human rights environment in Central and Eastern Europe, that many of the largest corporations are state-owned, and or that the state has still quite important role in the economy of Central and Eastern European countries. So without further ado, I will now give the floor to my fellow experts, and I will start with Olena. Olena, could you perhaps update us on the recent developments concerning potential national action plan on business and human rights of Ukraine? Please, Olena, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will start with a very brief presentation just to show key stages of Ukrainian very short but already very significant history on development of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights in Ukraine. First of all, I should say that academic community plays a very important role in these developments, and the first time when we discussed the business and human rights framework, it was in 2017 during Kharkiv Legal Forum, and that time we didn't have any representative from the state, from business, any of them didn't participate in the Kharkiv Legal Forum when we discussed the business and human rights framework at the first time. But we had, for example, the Danish Institute for Human Rights and the regional representative of Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and these very good experts gave us a very detailed perspective and actually gave us very good picture and framework of business and human rights developments at that moment in the world. In 2018, during Kharkiv Legal Forum, we already had the representatives of the Ukrainian government. Ministry of Justice joined us, and actually, and the Ombudsperson office joined us as well, and it was a really important moment. And also we had a very big Ukrainian company, DTEC, energy company. This company participated as well and showed some good practices from their perspective. And then after the forum, Kharkiv Legal Forum, Ministry of Justice actually started to work with business and human rights issues. And in January in 2019, Ministry of Justice announced the start of the UNGP's implementation, and Minister of Justice became the coordinator of the development of the National Baseline Assessment. It was the first step which should be done, the development of National Baseline Assessment, and my university developed the National Baseline Assessment on Business and Human Rights in Ukraine according to the methodology and with expert support of the Danish Institute for Human Rights. 2020 was the year when we had very hard start because Ukrainian government was changed, and we received a new team in the Ministry of Justice, and we should start from the discussion why actually business and human rights standards are important for Ukraine, and so on and so forth. The Ministry of Justice, a new team, became to work with updating of the national strategy for human rights in Ukraine, because the previous strategy was for 2015-2020, and they need to update the strategy, and we proposed to include to the new strategy, national strategy for human rights, new chapter on business and human rights. So to go the Georgian approach, and Ministry of Justice agreed, and it was supported by the Ombudsperson office, and actually they played a very important role as well. And several public discussions were conducted by the Ministry of Justice to discuss all proposals, what we should have in the chapter on business and human rights as the part of the national strategy for human rights. In November, we had the new national strategy for human rights with new action plan of implementation this strategy, and the chapter on business and human rights became the part of this national strategy. But actually, and just one moment important, there is one more important moment that the Deputy Ministry of Justice participated in the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in November last year, and she confirmed that Ukraine will implement UN guiding principles, and the national strategy will be adopted with the special chapter on business and human rights. And additionally, we will start to develop the standalone national action plan for business and human rights. So we will have the chapter on business and human rights, but it's very brief and very general, and that's why we will need to develop the standalone national action plan for business and human rights, which will be more detailed, and it will give us the chance to involve more stakeholders, more key actors to discussions, to this process of developing the standalone national action plan, because we did very fast process of developing the chapter on business and human rights as part of the national strategy for human rights. But at this moment, we are still waiting when the national strategy for human rights will be signed by the president of Ukraine. And actually the expectations were that the national strategy, updated national strategy, should be signed before the Human Rights Day, December in 2020, but we are still waiting. I asked the Ministry of Justice when it could be done. They are very optimistic that it should be in very few days, but again, the fact is that we are still waiting, and it could be explained that Ukraine has at the moment some other priorities, partly because of the COVID-19, of course, but partly because business and human rights are considered as something as obstacle to economic developments, because Ukraine announced this year a new economic strategy, and this strategy is saying that any new restrictions, any new obligations for businesses as a red flag. some concerns are related to this viewing of economic development in Ukraine, but we still hope that that we will we will implement the UN guiding principles, and we will not consider this process as obstacle for economic developments. So this is our current moment.
Great, Olena, for sharing this good news about development in Ukraine. For sure, it will be a huge step forward for the whole region if the second largest economy develops and adopts a standalone national action plan on business human rights. Also, given the fact that the Ukraine state is still very much active in the economy, there are many state-owned companies doing business in Ukraine, but also elsewhere in Central Eastern Europe. So great for sharing this news. All right, one of the countries which is perhaps forgotten in this discussion in business human rights, it's Macedonia, or as it's called since last year, North Macedonia. Anna, could you perhaps share any good practices that Macedonian companies employ when they do business either in Macedonia but also beyond its borders, and perhaps also whether the North Macedonian companies report on business and human rights standards in their annual reports? We know that Macedonia is it's in a negotiation process with the European Union, so perhaps some companies already report on non-financial indicators which European companies they have to do, obviously under the non-financial directive of the EU. Anna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Pretty much known faces. So to answer to your question, I think that as a practicing lawyer, I will draw my conclusions about the lessons learned or good practices from my legal practice. And I've decided to put them under different words because I believe in the power of wording in the business human rights discourse. So I would say the first one is patience. This topic is relatively new, as you mentioned, in this country. And therefore, when we advise clients about their corporate responsibility to respect human rights and explain that it is different from philanthropy or CSR approach, there is sort of a resistance and disappointment among the clients. I would say resistance because they very often argue that they work according to the law and they have adopted all the necessary policies or rule books. And there is a disappointment because they start developing a feeling that their practices may not be compliant with the business and human rights requirements besides what they do. Therefore, I have learned that you have to be very, you have to bring up this topic very slowly and with respect, because you don't want your clients to just run away and become scared. Unfortunately, we still need to bring up on the table the business case argument, and I do so because at least you have people and top management staff listening to you. It is very important if you have a reliable person from the company, I would say, with whom you can communicate on daily or weekly basis, depending on the case. And then what you saw is slowly they start kind of to digest the terminology, understand what does this really entail, and then you see tiny steps being taken by the companies. For example, changes of in the ethical code of conduct, or some substantive changes in the operational grievance mechanisms. And I'm very happy to see that in some companies with whom I work. And then you just hope that they will kind of embark in a more difficult part, and that is human rights due diligence. The second issue that I will kind of relate with good practice is having a tailor-made approach. And I think there is a lot of truth in the requirement of the UN guiding principles, especially second and third pillar, that every company is unique and that we cannot put all companies in the same box. And in the beginning, we've started to have kind of a guidance toolbox with questions, but then we have realized that we have to expand our horizon, because you see that it really depends so much on the size of the company, location, their business activities, etc. And the third issue will be cooperation. And as I've said, business human rights is sort of a baby if we compare it with the human development. And it is true that different sectors of the society are grasping the topics, and there are some NGOs which are more vocal in these areas, and others are focusing more on the specific groups such as LGBT or women, children, persons with disabilities. And on the other hand, in the legal sphere, you don't have a lot of lawyers that really give legal advice based on the UN guiding principle, for example, and therefore cooperation is very important, I would say, and then there needs to be kind of a synergy between at least those actors that are active on this topic. And therefore, for example, I've been invited on a couple of conferences or events where you really sit on the same table and discuss with government representatives or the business sector that they do have respective duties and obligations according to the UN guiding principle. And to answer to your second question, unfortunately, no, there is no requirement according to national law that legal entities need to report on the steps that they have taken in order to be compliant with the business and human rights requirement. It is even striking that small or medium-sized, let's say medium-sized companies don't even use human rights as a term in their annual reports. That doesn't mean they don't respect human rights. It's just that there is no awareness that they're doing it in line with international standards of business and human rights. We are more in the world of corporate social responsibility or philanthropy. And I wanted to bring this later on in the discussion, but I think that the European Union reports that you have mentioned are actually very good avenues to bring up the subject. What is noticeable is that in the European Union progress reports, North Macedonia, but not only North Macedonia, but also the other non-European Western Balkan countries don't report on the non-financial directive, and this business human rights is not even a topic. And I think it's really a good avenue to bring up this issue via the reports. So I wanted to say this kind of what can be done in the future, but I wanted to use the moment that you raised about the reports. Thank you. I will just stop here for a moment and give the floors to the other participants. Thank you.
Great, Anna. Thank you. Yes, you're right. Awareness of business human rights in Macedonia, but also elsewhere in Central Eastern Europe, it's quite weak, as you say. It's often conflated with corporate social responsibility or charity philanthropy. So it's good that we discuss and try to share awareness or bring awareness to this issue of binding standards, which companies but also states have to respect. One thing I have to mention, dear audience, dear participants, questions, of course, comments are welcome, and you can post them in the chat room of the Zoom application, and I will then read out at the end the questions and comments to the speakers, and they will try to answer them. So please feel free to post questions. They're most welcome. Now, one of the issues which is also quite important in Central Eastern Europe is how to, as Olena, you already mentioned, how to reconcile investment, liberalization, and human rights, respect for rule of law. In this respect, one of the countries which has opened immensely in the last decade or two for foreign investment has been Serbia. There are many foreign companies doing business in Serbia, both from other countries in Central Eastern Europe, but also beyond. We have recently heard, or we are following closely, the initiative by President Vučić which is making agreements, contracts with Chinese and Russian companies to bring a COVID-19 vaccine to Serbia. So it's a very open country concerning foreign investment and liberalization and doing business. But Nevenka, could you share if such development, high level of investment and liberalization is also coupled with respect in business and human rights? Has Serbia even considered to develop and draft a national action plan on business and human rights? Could you perhaps tell us your experience?
Thank you, Jernej. Yeah, yes, everything you mentioned is true, and my answer is no. So it's interesting, like we jumped on a business and human rights train pretty soon, like in 2012, we already kind of recognized the issue, but then the train hit a wall and things changed significantly, and our enthusiasm kind of deflated. So maybe through our struggles, we learned a lot. So we started in 2013 to introduce business and human rights concept to Serbia. And we also, as Elena said, we started in partnership with Danish Institute for Human Rights by working on a country guide. And it was coming from human rights field, it was a very important opportunity for us to acknowledge all the novelties that platform introduced, and we try to introduce them to state and companies as well. So country guides that we wrote were based for consultation that developed pretty fast and intensive at the beginning, so in 2013, and dialogue on human rights and business with state, corporate, and civil society actors. We had numerous meetings, roundtables, conferences, and we tried to identify the gaps, but also identify relevant initiatives that are consolidating already existing efforts in various areas that in relation to UNGPs. So that led to us drafting a national baseline assessment that was at that point focused only on Pillar 1. But we are hoping to have baseline assessment now that will cover all 3 pillars by the end of this year. So with our enthusiasm, we were really hoping that baseline assessment will eventually serve as the basis of a national action plan. And talks were pretty intensive with the ministries at that point, but here we are almost 10 years after, and there is no sign of action plan on the horizon. And at the moment, the whole process is stalling, and we are trying to revive it and implement what we learned during the very long process. And that is actually the main lessons that we can take from the process. Is so, although it would be great to have an action plan, this process helps us acknowledge how kind of road is long, and although it is a bit disappointing, it doesn't really have to be, as work needs to be done anyway. I mean, so why not use the whole process to whole process of adoption, discussions, to try to slowly move things forward. So this is one of the good things of being late to the party, because now, 7 years later, we have opportunity to avoid all the obstacles that were encountered by other countries. For example, we now know that how important it is to have cross-ministerial cooperation, but also on the other side, how important it is to have one strong carrier of the action plan development. So from learning from success stories, it seems that it is important to have one ministry, which we at the moment don't have, that is operationally ready to carry NAP over the finish line. And most importantly, to be aware that it's adopting an action plan. So the mere adoption doesn't mean anything without following through later. So I would have to say that this continues to be one of the main challenges, as one of the reasons for stalling the whole process is lack of the link between human rights bodies and bodies that are in charge of economy development and investment. So they really don't see and recognize themselves as a partner. So at the moment, our priority is to show the importance of that link. And through this long process, we also learned what to focus on, because one of the main conclusions of baseline assessment was that the legal framework relevant to the application of the first pillar of the UNGPs is relatively well developed. The shortcomings observed are largely related to the problems of inconsistent implementations of these regulations. So regarding regulations, we are constantly in a process of numerous reform processes, and they are currently underway in Serbia, and many of which have direct implications in the field of business and human rights. For example, such as introduction of non-financial corporate reporting or taking into account social and environmental criteria when conducting public procurement. So the main challenge that we experience is explaining and clarifying what is the added value of National Action Plan. And that is really hard to explain to all stakeholders involved. So I think that is a bit of a trauma of like legislative inflation that happened during the transition, because we had like numerous laws and policies adopted and enormous volume, but without like follow through. So that is the paradox, I think, in general, of introducing UNGPs into developing countries. So the key is to show that this area is very specific, because actually codification and acknowledgement of constant idea and concept cross-cutting and due diligence can bring significant improvements. So for this part, I would try to finish this brief overview on a positive note, as we will hopefully address challenges later. So at the moment, we are hoping to identify stakeholders that would be willing to take kind of this journey with us, especially businesses. And it is harder than we thought at the beginning, because to be honest, they all, we have to find the ones that are really willing to develop and kind of transfer the good practices rather than exploit the weaknesses of the system that they're doing business in. So I have to say that kind of with regret, it feels that we are at the beginning again, but this time things are different, because stakeholders, including us as well, we have knowledge, expertise on business and human rights, and we've been learning a lot from experiences all over the world in similar situations. So although it feels like a beginning, it seems that also it could be a crucial turning point to move things in the right directions this time around. Yeah, so we can discuss challenges later. There are many.
Thank you, Nemena, for this insightful input into the Serbian context. Yeah, you're right. I mean, those challenges you mentioned, they are not only Serbian, they go beyond also CEE context. We know that now, almost 10 years after the adoption of UNGPs on business human rights, only 24, 25 countries worldwide adopted national action plans. So there is much to be done. Now let's turn to Slovenian context, to Slovenian example. And Nevena and Anna already mentioned non-financial reporting, and which is compulsory under the EU law. And Gora is welcome with us. I know that well, we both recently co-authored an article on how Slovenian companies report on non-financial indicators in their annual reports, and we also measured that. We rank the companies which are listed at the A quotation of the Slovenian Stock Exchange. Could you perhaps tell us about that, and also perhaps about Slovenian experience of Slovenian companies doing business elsewhere in Central Eastern Europe? Perhaps Slovenian companies can bring business and human standards to Central and Eastern Europe. We know, for example, that the largest Slovenian banking group, NLB, recently acquired the third largest Serbian bank, commercial bank, So perhaps through that, also the standards can be expanded to other countries in Central Eastern Europe. Goras, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Jerne. Thank you very much also for the invitation to this event, and to all the other colleagues today joining us, and also to all the listeners. It is always very interesting to talk about business and human rights, since, as you have mentioned at the beginning, I guess we are not really such a mainstream group dealing with these issues, but hopefully maybe in some due time this will become a mainstream topic also on the other, let's say, events and so on. However, as you have already mentioned, yes, during the last, let's say, year and a half or something like that, we have done together a research, and maybe just from my side to explain just some of the findings, the key findings which we have found out. As you have mentioned, we have taken into account the 9 companies that are listed in the A quotation of the Ljubljana Stock Exchange. So meaning these are the 9, let's say, flagship companies from Slovenia, which also have to, let's say, take into account some additional criteria in sense of additional and more transparency or reporting and so on. So we have also adopted, or let's say implemented or applied our, let's say, own methodology how to measure business and human rights in these companies. And we have analyzed in this regard the following 4 topics, or let's say views which needed to be considered. So first, how the companies respect the Slovene constitutional order. Second, how the companies respect human rights through their business processes. And third, how the companies respect human rights through their supply chains processes. And last, but of course not least, how the companies have organized their internal complaint or mediation systems in regard of human rights, if of course they are in the cases if they are violated. Now we have applied, of course, some measurable numbers and so on, and the maximum of points which a company could gain was actually 8. And I can say that out of these 9 observed companies, 3 out of these 9 companies have received all 8 points. And the lowest amount which was received by only 1 company was actually 5 points. So altogether, we could say that after analyzing, of course, I have to stress again that these were annual business reports, which of course are a normative, so to say, example of what businesses or companies do. So on the basis of this, we in a way could conclude, or could say that in a pretty good manner, we could say that the flagship companies which we observed are pretty much respecting business and human rights. Practically there was not even 1 company that wouldn't at least mention these topics somewhere in their annual reports and so on. Of course, and maybe here I can already jump to your second question, is of course what is going on in practice. Of course, we have analyzed because some of the companies have explicitly stated that yes, they are also following business and human rights rules and all the rules which applied in Slovenia, also on the territories or in the countries where they do business. I think there were 2 or 3 companies which have explicitly also stated in their annual reports that they do that. However, I mean, is that done in practice? Of course, that would take another, let's say, research which we would need to do on the field. And I think this is probably the next challenge, let's say, for our group, maybe to analyze and to do some research also in this regard. And as you have mentioned, of course, Slovenia is, especially in some countries, let's say like in Bosnia, I think it's still number 2 or number even 1 investor. It depends on the year. Also in Northern Macedonia, Slovenia is a very important investor. Also in Serbia, it is not in the sense of amount of the investments, but in the sense of the numbers of investments. I think it's even listed before Austria and so on. So it's an important investor in this region, and of course also by transferring the knowledge, transferring the practices to the region. Also, this could be done. But of course, not to forget that Slovenia has ever since been also very, or Slovenian companies have ever since been very, let's say, cooperative or working a lot also with countries of the former, yes, Soviet Union or the V4 countries, and also a lot of activities, business activities, especially among also this observed 9 companies, are also being dealt in this region, where of course it is maybe a little bit different than when speaking about the, let's say, former Yugoslavia countries. Maybe I will stop at this point and join the discussion later on. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Goras, for this insight in your research in the role of extraterritorial obligations that Slovenian companies may have when they do business abroad. Now, last but not least, we move to Sinisa Milatovic of UNDP. Sinisa is a known name in business human rights in Central Eastern Europe. He, some months ago, in November last year, if I'm not mistaken, Sinisa, you co-organized a regional forum on business human rights in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Perhaps could you share with us some insights of how UNDP tries to share the knowledge about the standards in business human rights in the region, and are there any best practices in the field of business human rights you want to highlight from your work? Sinisa.
Thanks, Jerne. Thanks very much again for organizing this event and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak with all of you. So, mindful of the time, I'll try to be brief. I'll focus on 3 main things, sort of from the global to the country specific, and then try to look forward in terms of UNDP engagement. First of all, UNDP started its engagement on business and human rights effectively in an organized fashion 5 years ago in Asia. And this has since evolved into a kind of a global program. And its focus is on 3 main things. One is to develop laws and policies, and particularly national action plans. So UNDP is supporting, for instance, or did support Thailand in adopting and drafting its national action plan, is doing the same thing in Pakistan, India, Indonesia, and so on. I don't want to name every country. This has, moved on to Africa. We're doing some work in the Arab states and in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. The second aspect of our work, let's say, which is perhaps the one we dedicate least amount of time to, but is nonetheless very important, is to work directly with businesses to develop human rights due diligence practices and so on. On the other hand, we're quite mindful of who we work with because of the risk of so-called blue washing, etc. But we have developed some tools that, again, I'll talk about in a bit, to support businesses doing human rights due diligence. And the third aspect of our work, generally speaking, globally, is to support civil society and national human rights institutions in essentially advocating for the victims of human rights abuses by businesses, in strengthening their access to remedies and so on. So our work has been with NHRIs, resources to connect, supporting their work otherwise, and so on. So general areas, let's say, of our work in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, divided regions, and the where is Eastern Asia. In November last year, towards the end of November, we organized a regional forum. Hello? Okay.
We can hear you, Sinisa. The connection is a bit weak.
Okay. Let me know if sorry, I don't know why that happened, but I'll keep going. I hope you don't lose me. So
Go ahead, yeah.
we had we started a regional forum in Asia 5 years ago, which has grown from 120 participants to over 6,000. And we know the benefits it brings. These include, let's say, competition, good-natured competition among states. So this year we had, for instance, in South Asia, Pakistan presenting a national action plan because in part we believe because it had been exposed to other countries in the region developing national action plans and so on. So on the basis of that, we developed and organized last year a regional forum in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. As Janne mentioned, we had also, let's say, side events on Southeastern Europe, on forced labor in Eastern Europe, and so on. Our goal was to raise awareness, gather policymakers, exchange best practices, and we thought it was a good start, and we will replicate it towards the end of this year again. So we intend for this to be an annual tradition, if you will, going forward, because we thought it was quite useful. We had over 400 participants this time, and we're hoping to grow it. And we are looking forward, I'll talk a bit about what we're going to do next. But as I said, I want to talk about the global level, which I mentioned, the regional level, and the country level. At the country level, for instance, in Ukraine, we've done some work. Our country office there was instrumental in working on the national human rights strategy and essentially advocating for a separate national action plan because we're aware of the specificities of business and human rights and all the issues that it entails. It's not a traditional human rights issue. It's not only state responsibilities that we're talking about and so on. In fact, I'll send, or rather a copy into the chat box when I'm finished, a blog that our resident representative and one of our colleagues who works on human rights wrote on how UNDP Ukraine is exploring, what avenues it's exploring to strengthen the implementation of UNGPs and essentially to try and deal with the consequences of COVID-19 and heightened inequality and also the specificities of conflict in Eastern Ukraine and so on. So all of this to say is that we're expanding our work in Eastern Europe on business and human rights. Another example that I like to point to is we developed a rapid self-assessment for businesses on human rights and due diligence. So this is in the wake of COVID-19 last year, a year ago, when COVID-19 struck, we developed this rapid self-assessment. So it was for businesses to essentially have a sort of a checklist to check whether they're being compliant with their obligations under the UNGPs. This obviously draws on ILO conventions, core human rights treaties, and so on. And we promoted this, and Turkish companies have taken this up. We had an event a few months ago. The Global Compact has joined in, and so on. So there are things happening on the ground in a few different countries, not necessarily in every country in the region, but we have country offices supporting processes where they're happening or starting to support processes. So in terms of what next, actually, I don't want to sound an overly optimistic note because, there's no real reason for huge optimism, but the last year's forum showed us the way. We have to focus on what we call the ABCs. So this is raising awareness. It's just a fact of life that this is not a well-known issue or framework of thinking about corporate obligations in the region, or indeed in many other regions. It's not necessarily that we are, as a region, unique. The same can be said of the Arab states region, the sub-Saharan Africa region, and so on. We have to create demand for this. We have to strengthen unions and engage national human rights institutions more. So I think, Janne, you wrote about this in the wake of last year's forum about the weakness of institutions, most notably the judiciary, but other institutions as well. And we also have to, what we found useful is to essentially engage or have some sort of champions in the business sector and elsewhere in government, champions of this agenda. So we have to find these sort of champions, these actors who want to promote this agenda, who believe in it, and so on. If possible, from all three sectors, both from government, business, and from civil society and trade unions, but preferably, obviously, from the business sector. We will be doing what we call horizon scanning, so not to use this sort of jargon too much, but essentially looking forward in the next month or two in terms of what works, what are the lessons we learned, and so on, and what gaps there are in research and analysis. And I think one example of further research, Gora's mentioned the research that you guys did Slovenian companies, I looked, I don't know how familiar all of you are with the corporate human rights benchmark. It's an organization that puts out a report every year on a few hundred leading companies and their compliance with the UN guiding principles. I had a quick look on, how many companies from the region made it into the corporate human rights benchmark and what their scores were. And actually, it's somewhat depressing. I mean, the figures are from 2018 and 19, the ones that I downloaded. But essentially, there's 9 companies, 8 of which are from Russia, and companies are scored on lots of variables, including policy commitments, whether they have a policy commitment, a human rights policy, whether they carry out human rights due diligence, and whether they embed respect for human rights in their company practices, how they perform, whether they have a remediation agreements mechanism, and so on. So they're scored from 0 to 100, and the scores for the companies in the region, as I mentioned, 8 of which are large, mostly extractive companies from Russia, 1 of which is from Poland. The scores were mostly from the 0 to 10 or 10 to 20 range. And one company scored the highest score in the region, was 32.7. You can download the data on the corporate human rights benchmark site. So all of this to say, not to say this is not exactly a large sample. I'm not making a claim about human rights compliance of companies in the region on the basis of this, but it's kind of indicative of where we need to go. We need to further this research and essentially create this sort of demand among consumers. I mean, I'll be glad to talk about it a bit more when you ask further questions, but I'll stop here for now in terms of what next. Thanks.
Great, Sinisha. A lot of information to take in. You're right. The region of Central Eastern Europe is very complex. It's very diverse, as you say. There are some countries which are members of the EU, others which are members of the Council of Europe, and also there are countries there's a country which is not a member of any of international organizations. So it's different environments, different approaches to business and human rights. And as you say, one of the common problems we face in our region are weak institutions, no? And especially judiciary is particularly weak, which is highlighted by the fact that so many of individuals for the region they turn to European Court of Human Rights with applications. Every year we measure in thousands, no? Applications from Central and Eastern European countries. Now, let us just for a brief moment look at one question from the audience. Christopher Patz from European Coalition for Corporate Justice. Good to have you with us, Christopher. Christopher is asking about upcoming potential EU due diligence directive, which has been proposed and has been discussed in the EU settings for last couple of months. Just last week, the European Parliament adopted a resolution with the draft text of the directive. Christopher, if you allow me, as far as Slovenian government position goes, as far as I know, the current state is that the Slovenian government does not have a position as of this moment. It's quite early to have a position on this directive, but given the commitment of the government to the business human rights standards, to the national action plan, I would say that it's highly likely that Slovenia will support this directive. Now, at the negotiation, but Christopher, do not hold my word if something changes in the position of the government. I would say that it's highly likely that it will be supported, also because of the fact that not so many companies which are based in Slovenia would fall within the ambit of the directive. If the ambit of the directive will be the same as the non-financial directive, so 500 employees or more, there are around 50-60 companies which would fall within the ambit of the directive. So, all right, if any of you have any questions, comments, please post a question into into a chat section of the Zoom. For the second round of questions, perhaps I would ask each of our panelists to briefly comment on the future directions of business and human rights in Central and Eastern Europe. We know that within the EU and the Council of Europe and some national environments, there is a strong move towards binding due diligence regulation. We have examples from France, from the Netherlands, from UK, from Switzerland. Do you perhaps see that such binding regulation could also be translated in the Central Eastern context? And my second question to all of you would be, what are the greatest challenges in introducing business human rights standards in the Central Eastern European countries? Which are the major impediments? We mentioned weak institutions, weak rule of law, but beyond that, where do you see difficulties in translating the standards to local environments and in Central and Eastern Europe? Perhaps this time we can start with Anna. What is your take on this?
Thank you very much. Concerning the challenges, I think in order to address this question or two questions, we first need to set the business and human rights climate in the country. And you have mentioned already that North Macedonia is not in the list of countries that has a national human rights assessment. It doesn't have neither a national action plan on business and human rights. And I think this is a huge drawback because we don't have let's say a kind of a mapping of the institutions and the burning issues related to business and human rights. Also, there is no lex specialis piece of legislation on business and human rights, and I'm mostly a proponent on a mandatory human rights due diligence, because I think that at least practice shows here that whenever you have a norm, a rule within a law with penalties, it functions. Whenever it is something which is non-binding or even an international standard, at least I'm speaking from our national context, companies don't take it very seriously. So I think we need a specific piece of legislation, because now what we have around hundreds of laws which touch upon different issues like, I don't know, environment, anti-corruption, labor, which is all good, but they are spread and we don't have one which unites them all. And I think it will be a huge asset if we have one concrete piece of legislation which really target the obligation of businesses, maybe some incentives and penalties in this area. Also, what we lack is, and I think Olena really mentioned it very well, is the need to have one state organ which kind of leads the process. We don't have one. I guess that the Ministry of Labor and Social Policy might be a good candidate, because a number of companies that they have issued their willingness to grasp this topic. The ombudsperson, I think they don't consider that much that this is a topic of their relevance, because they're mostly concentrated on the actions and or non-actions of state organs vis-a-vis human rights, and they don't really work a lot with companies. And I think that another challenge, at least what was evident in North Macedonia, but also I guess in other countries, was the COVID situation, which really, I think, kind of even alienated further discussion of business and human rights. And I think it will take a while until we don't feel the consequences of the COVID. What is evident is that there were a lot of violations, especially of labor rights, and NGOs register, I don't know, collective licensing of employees or a gender dimension in the violation of human rights, pressure of employees to sign out-of-court agreements for employment termination or severe reduction of salaries. So these were kind of really burning issues due to the COVID. What was also remarkable was that, at least I find it like that a lot of companies, they say in the name of promoting human rights, and in this case, the right to health, paid or gave donations to private hospitals or to the Ministry of Health. And this act was seen as a public good, and as a consequence of that, they were subject to tax reduction. And my question is whether this was really kind of an act of promoting human rights, or there is something else, like this act is more, there is a disguised interest in it. Another challenge was the access to healthcare. We really feel it because there are a lot of private hospitals here which can treat COVID patients, and they can make tests, but on a very high cost. So you have only a portion of the population that really can afford this treatment. And there was a reaction of a couple of NGOs, and what they really wanted to do is to put a pressure on the private hospitals that the patients can pay up until the maximum amount that they normally pay when they have a treatment in a state hospital, but this of course failed. From the victim side, I mentioned a couple of issues. Most of them are related with the labor rights, and they are very well noted in a country reports of the U.S. Department of State. So jeopardy in future employment of employees, non-payment of salary benefits. So these are kind of the common questions or kind of problems that victims have when they come in the office. And regards to solution forward, I've put them into 3 clusters, let's say. So I think that work should be done on different levels. There should be a sensibility of this topic among the government institutions. One way is to integrate it with the European Union reports, but also there is a changes in the legislation that I've mentioned. Then awareness raising among legal practitioners and business sector, because judges, lawyers, or prosecutors don't speak with a human rights language when we see corporate related violations of human rights. They see it as a tort, as a breach of obligation, a crime, but not necessarily with the language that we use it here. And I guess I agree with Sinisha that we really need to engage with the business sector much more. I guess a nice avenue is a Chamber of Commerce, when they really need to bring this up to the agenda. And then of course trainings, trainings on different issues, best practices in conducting human rights due diligence, multi-stakeholder participation, and developing a comprehensive business and human rights policy, etc. So these are kind of the 3 issues which I pinpointed just as a short summary of how we can go further. Thank you. Yeah. I give the floor to you.
Great. Thanks, Anna. Many proposals which we can subscribe to move forward. Olena, how would you say which are the major challenges to business human rights in Ukraine, both from the government perspective and from business perspective? There are many large corporations doing business in Ukraine. Where do you see possibility to perhaps introduce more mandatory standards in their business operations?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Actually, there are many challenges, of course, and there are many common challenges for our region, and of course, lack of trust from businesses to the state, from society to businesses, and from society to the state as well, and lack of access to justice, especially. Maybe not especially, but in particular for non-state mechanisms and so on and so forth, and unfortunately high level of corruption. You know all of these challenges, and I could recommend as well to read the blog which was prepared by Yerny Chernich for the Business and Human Rights Journal blog, and very good explain all these challenges for the region. As for Ukrainian perspective, again, I think that one of key challenges for us is that it looks like that our government is trying to balance between people expectations to economic developments and actually willingness of Ukrainian government to harmonize legal and political systems and market with again with European Union, and I think that we should start from the explanation that these two aims are not actually they are correlated to each other, and Sinisha mentioned the blog which was published by UNDP in Ukraine team, Responsible Business Conduct Accelerates Social and Economic Development. And I think that this blog explains very good that we should not consider the business and human rights standards as something that will be obstacle for economic developments, and we have extremely other situation. Business and human rights implementation should contribute to sustainable economic development and actually to sustainable democracy in our country. So I think that it should be a very key step, a very first step to explain to key actors and to broad audience this may be easy issue, but still important issue, and more technical challenge that when we start to work with national action plan, we need to have very inclusive process. It's important, of course, but in our countries, we start to work with key stakeholders who don't understand very often, don't understand the key messages of UN guiding principles, of responsible business conduct principles. And we have the situation when we need to have national action plan to raise awareness, but we start to work to develop national action plan with key actors who also need to be equipped some knowledge on business and human rights. So I think it's could be a challenge for my country as well.
Great, Elena. Yes, the challenges are very similar all across Central and Eastern Europe. Governments are often more inclined to favor liberalization, privatization, investments, which is understandable from one point of view, but certainly also binding standards are very essential for development, as you say, rule of law, strong institutions. Now, as we talk about development of business human rights standards in our region, all of you have mentioned a great input and great impact of international actors. And Nevena, perhaps you can elaborate a bit on how do you see the role of and the impact of European international actors in moving forward in business human rights in Serbia, but also beyond in Central Eastern Europe. You mentioned that the Danish Institute of Human Rights was involved in drafting national baseline assessment of business human rights in Serbia. Would you say that this such a impact or such a contribution by European and international actors is welcome, or would you say that perhaps it's better that incentive for binary relation comes from bottom up, from local civil society, from politicians that consider that it's necessary to improve business human rights in Serbia? How do you assess this interplay between the international standards and also also local standards and local actors?
Well, business and human rights standards, as we mentioned, are not per se like on a radar in Serbia. So I think that we need to combine the kind of pressure from the EU, especially. Like, for example, like in the last 3 years, reports, progress reports on Serbia are getting like more and more dramatic in terms of rule of law, access to remedy, and all other aspects of human rights and democratization. So I actually think that we, from bottom up, need to present the business as human rights as a tool. I think that is our chance to overcome those gaps and kind of offer a new angle, because one of the examples could be like we had a great response from trade unions when we talked about business and human rights concept. This was new to them as well, because they also feel that they're stuck in the dialogue that is kind of overrun by time, and they see a breath of fresh air in this. But in terms of government, that is the main challenge, and the biggest one is how to approach government that needs at the end to be a leading force in this process, at least to put a final stamp and accept it. And in case of Serbia, I think that another good step could be through intensifying talk on a third pillar and access to remedy that we usually forget, because that is the way how we can go from bottom up, encourage right holders to use it, and then eventually we can come to a legislation that will say, okay, let's better prevent this than have this huge influx of people rightly demanding their rights. So it is pretty complex, and listening to Anna and Elena, it can be transferred to Serbian context like almost a mirror-like, but there are a few specifics, and I think that is the major benefit of regional cooperation is actually that we take, but we cannot copy paste. That's another thing that kind of, this is a good opportunity to mention that, because there are specifics. And not to go further into that, but you mentioned that type of companies, and actually studying investors in each country is very important, because on the first glance it looks the same, but differences could be very, very big. So those are kind of like food for our thoughts in future. Yeah.
Thank you, Nevena. Yeah, one can agree with you that perhaps a combination is needed between foreign and also local approaches, and of course, the local capacity is often lacking in Central and Eastern Europe, as it lacks elsewhere around the world. And in this regard, Sinisha, I would like to ask you, Central and Eastern Europe is one of the regions which has been perhaps a bit lacking in this business human rights developments. We know that most of the countries which have adopted national action plans are from Western European, Northern American group within the United Nations. There are not many countries beyond this group which adopted national action plans. And as you told us, you have experience for working in other regions around the world, Asia, Arab countries, Africa. Is there a good practice which you would highlight for the region of Central Eastern Europe, which could be, translated from perhaps Southeast Asia? We know that last week your colleagues convened an excellent regional forum on business human rights in Southeast Asia. Are there any good practices which perhaps also our region of Central Eastern Europe could benefit from?
Thanks, Yevne. Thanks for the question. So, well, two things. I mean, I'm not going to talk too much about the challenges because pretty much everything has already been said, you know, weakness of institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So in response to your question, I think Nevena hinted at this and so on. The main driving force is either, you know, if you think of it typologically as, look, why do countries do X? Why do they adopt something they don't have to adopt? And then you have this typology, you know, I don't know, for the academically minded, you have Goodwin, Jinks, and some of these professors who wrote about this, and then sociologists who wrote about this. And it's persuasion, sanction, or acculturation. So, you know, there's no real sanction here. So acculturation, it really is an acculturation, meaning essentially you want to be seen to belong. And you do see that in Southeast Asia, you see in South Asia, you see that among countries, you know, where countries have come to UNDP and said, wait a second, they're doing this? I mean, unnamed country X is doing this. We want to do it as well, you know, without necessarily, they don't want to be left out, they don't want to be left behind. You see that generally in human rights work, you know, that's why what the power of, you know, Freedom House lists is and so on, where countries don't want to be seen to be last and so on. So I think there definitely is, with Thailand being the leading country in Southeast Asia, some dominoes started to fall. I mean, this is all very provisionally because essentially we are yet to talk about implementation, but it is a big step to develop a national action plan and so on. I think we even have an advantage. I mean, we have the Human Rights Due Diligence Directive or regulation or whatever coming up. We have on the doorstep of our region, Germany, Netherlands, France, and the UK already, and so on. I don't want to discuss every country in turn. With human rights due diligence legislation, you know, we need to, in my mind, the focus should be on creating a legal case. And obviously, if you're in the EU, that's one. If you're a candidate country, that's two. If you're in a neighborhood country, that's three kind of levels removed. But you still have, you know, you could have an obligation, let's say. You need to have a business case, which could be stronger in a way than in many other countries, just because of the close links with the EU market and with the EU being the leading force on this, you know, in many ways. You really have, you know, a strong case to make to say, look, you know, this is the business case. I mean, the business case, to be honest, let's be honest, nobody's ever made a convincing business case in business human rights. There is no empirically verified, academically, you know, waterproof business case on business and human rights. But if there's going to be anywhere if there's going to be lots of arguments anywhere, that it's going to be in this region. So I would say, you know, if you combine the external sanction, if you will, due to the legal changes coming up, with acculturation, with just generally the idea that, look, things are happening and so on, that's where we, you know, should look to draw on for change. Everything else comes on the back of it. Nevena hinted at this. You know, civil society needs the support. Trade unions are weak. Judiciaries are also fairly weak. You know, NHRIs, it depends. But yes, there actually has been some encouraging, you know, news from even Albania, Georgia, and so on. But this isn't to say that there really is a tremendously strong basis without an external pressure to get things moving. So unfortunately, I wish I could say, yes, this is, in fact, you know, we're going to look to, I don't know, internal forces, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be happening. We need to look externally, and we need to draw ourselves even closer in that sense to the EU and the trends that are going on within the EU. Thanks.
Great, Sinisha. As you say, they're both external, but also internal pressures in some context to adopt binding standards. And one of the areas, or one of the geographical areas where these external pressures or internal pressures are very much present is the EU. We know that, as Christopher already mentioned in the comment section, that the EU is preparing a directive on due diligence and corporate responsibility. But this is not the only development within the EU. Just recently, the Council of the European Union adopted 2 decisions as to the new EU sanctions regime, which also gives possibility to impose sanctions on companies which were involved in human rights violations or corruption or banking frauds and so. So the legal framework is getting stronger. And we also know that a year ago, if I remember correctly, there was quite a huge discussion whether the three countries which a year ago were taking over the presidency of the Council of European Union were discussing whether business human rights should be one of the agendas, on the top topical points to move forward for their presidency, Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia. But unfortunately, nothing has happened in that respect. Germany did move forward with its own proposal on due diligence in their national systems. Portugal presidency perhaps was so far a bit, if you allow me, a bit disappointing as to business human rights reform is concerned. And Goras, if I ask you, I know that Slovenia is taking over the presidency of the Council of Europe on 1st of July of this year, no? And if I'm correct, Goras, one of the topics which the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Slovenia is highlighting as one of the priorities to Slovenian presidency of the Council is the improving resilience and capacity of the European Union to deal with these threats which we are all facing the last year. And so my question to you, Goras, would be, would you say that also business and human rights could perhaps fall with these priorities of Slovenian government for its 6 months presidency of the Council of European Union, also given the Slovenian best practices in the last years in business human rights, particularly concerning the reform of standards concerning the respect for business human rights in the activities of state-owned companies. Would you say that there is a possibility also that Slovenia could perhaps push forward this agenda which Christopher already mentioned, not only concerning due diligence directive, but also perhaps to introduce, business human rights as one of the areas in order to improve the capacity and resilience of the EU and its member states to deal with natural catastrophes as the one we have been dealing for the past year.
Yes, thank you, Erne, for this question. Yes, I mean, of course, as said, we are, I guess, here, all of us that are probably listening and taking part in this conversation today, we, of course, all of us would probably wish that this would be one of the priorities of our EU presidency. And I can say, at least from my side, that at our foreign ministry, Slovenian foreign ministry, this is definitely a very important topic. It's very high on the agenda. I was just recently having a discussion with our former OECD ambassador, Slovenian ambassador, and he actually pointed also this topic out. I mean, on his when he was having his hearing at the foreign ministry. So I think that this is something which is already among the, let's say, the governmental officials, and so this topic is on the agenda. Of course, we have to have in mind that for the last year and a little bit more, so let's say for the last 13, 14 months, practically the European Union and practically the whole world has been dealing with some serious other issues. Not to use the word catastrophe, and of course heavy economic instruments were used, and we can talk about instruments which have not been used in this scale, or in this amount ever since the Second World War. And of course we'll see what the consequences of all this will also bring during this year and probably the next one, in sense of the sovereign debt and so on. But we'll see how the European will react, how the European Union here will react. And if I may just a little bit let's say, compare this topic with the sustainable development, where I see definitely European Union as one of the, let's say, the flagship carriers of the topic. I'm pretty much sure that also business and human rights should be one of the topics where the European Union could and should play their role. And maybe just for my conclusion, if we are talking also about some challenges and maybe put forward also some possible ideas. I mean, usually we economists are usually talking about state-owned enterprises as something which is not, if it's in too much, too large scale, not of something which is very good. But I think that especially in this region here, a large proportion of the economy is still somehow in state-owned. Being state-owned, and of course, wherever there are governments committed to, let's say, business and human rights, they can put these policies through their, let's say, holdings or whatever that organizations are, which are dealing with the state-owned enterprises. They could put this agenda on into their, let's say, policies and so on. So here, I think something beneficial could be also due to this issue, which is usually, at least from the Western side, seen as something which is not that good. But in this sense, I think the countries could push forward these policies through their mechanisms, which they have through their state-owned enterprises, and they could be, let's say, the first one that would start using this and practicing also this. Thank you.
Thank you, Goras, for your comments and suggestions to how to move forward. Today's forum, as you heard, addressed many of the complex issues concerning business human rights in Central Eastern Europe, but also good practices and best practices. The region is not at stalemate, you know, it's progressing in this field. If you remember, 10 years ago, the region has really moved forward as to business and human rights standards, both because of external pressures, but also because of internal pressures, also due to all of you who are working in this field in the region. I hope you will be continuing working in the future. One thing I wanted to mention before we conclude today's forum, today's session, is that the Business and Human Rights Scholars Association has last year established a chapter, a subsection on Central Eastern Europe. And if any of you is interested to join this chapter on business rights in Central Eastern Europe, please email either Olena or myself, and we'll be happy to put you down as a member. Also, another thing is that in the next weeks, hopefully, Olena, we will finally publish the call for papers for a special issue of Business and Human Rights Journal, which is a Cambridge journal, a special issue on Central Eastern Europe, which is envisaged for 2022-2023. So we will be all invited to either contribute shorter pieces or articles. So there are many initiatives going on in Central and Eastern Europe, and please stay tuned. Also in the next months, perhaps we'll try to organize another forum with Goras, a member from Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to perhaps discuss the Slovenian agenda for the presidency in this respect. Otherwise, my dear friends, dear colleagues, Nevena, Olena, Goras, Anna, and Sinisha, thank you very much for your time, for your comments, for your energy. And thank you very much also to all participants who waited until the end of today's forum. All the best from here in Ljubljana, and I hope to see you at some other events. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.